Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Indiana season is over. The Hoosiers fall 85-69 on Sunday night in Albany, New York, to Miami. Indiana finishes the season 23-12. Joining us today on Podcast on the Brink from a car somewhere outside of, I believe, Syracuse, New York, Rick Bozich of WDRB TV in Louisville, WDRB.com. He was in Albany, New York for Indiana's both of the tournament games against Kent State and Miami. What, just big picture, are your takeaways from the loss to Miami? Obviously, Indiana beaten pretty soundly on the board, statistically speaking. That was the difference. But overall, it felt like just from the opening tip that Miami was the more athletic, the more aggressive team, and really kind of put Indiana on its heels from the opening tip.
Yeah, I mean, I've got several takeaways. One is micro and a couple are macro. And the micro level, when they fell behind 13-3, they didn't seem to play with the tenacity or the urgency that they played with against Kent State. Body language was bad in the second defensive possession or offensive possession. It was defensive. Jalen Hood-Schifino took a shot to the groin and really seemed to get thrown off of his game. The other guys on defense and rebounding seemed a little bit surprised by how aggressive and quick Miami was, like they weren't expecting it or they weren't ready for it. And, they were out of the game quickly and had expended a lot of energy to get back into it and finished the half fine with, that 5-0 run to cut it to 40-35 and then went ahead. But Miami's athleticism and depth was too much for Indiana. And that's my micro take. My macro take is that they need better players. They need more of them. They need guys who can play the 1, 2, 3, and 4, who can shoot the ball and drive the ball. I think the team they had was really good at two positions, and the other three just not good enough to consistently beat good teams. And with the two best players leaving, it's going to be interesting to see how Mike Woodson moves forward.
Were you surprised at all this season, just in general, that Indiana took a step back defensively from the team we saw last year? Mike Woodson in his first season puts together the best defense in the Big Ten, and then this year, obviously, they took a step back. The absence of Xavier Johnson had something to do with that, but overall, when you look at some of the numbers that Indiana put together defensively this season, there was regression, and I thought that was a pretty big part of a lot of these games where they lost. It wasn't even close, like double-figure losses in a lot of games, and then they end the season kind of in the same way, losing by 16. It just seemed like defensively this team really never put it together consistently.
Yeah, I mean, I think Xavier Johnson was a big part of it because he's their best and most tenacious on-the-ball defender, and once he was gone, that's the first line of defense, is the pressuring the primary ball handler on the other team, and neither Jalen Hood-Schifino nor Trey Galloway is as good as Xavier Johnson is that. And once the point guard on the other team can attack you off the dribble and make plays happen, then you're in recovery mode. And the forwards aren't super athletic forwards who aren't really good at that. And Trace Jackson Davis ended up blocking a lot of shots to help the defense be what it was. So, as I said in the other macro point, is got to get better players who can move and cover more spots. The game has changed; it's more spread out. I mean, it was obvious Miami's view was we're going to spread them out and drive them, one-on-one, and they were able to do that successfully. I mean, several times they waited till like the last 5 seconds of the shot clock and gave the ball either to Wong or the kid's name who transferred in from George Mason, who had the great game, number 11.
Jordan Miller.
Yeah, he looked like he was totally fearless that he could beat his guy off the dribble, and he could. He was quicker than either Kopp or Race Thompson, and then get to the rim and score. And that was an issue. I mean, Race Thompson had a great career, stayed 6 years. Miller Kopp did some good things happen, but athleticism is not the forte of either one of those guys, being able to move side to side and good teams took advantage of that.
One of the reasons that Mike Woodson chose to ride the starters so much, guys like Miller Kopp and Race Thompson, is that, in the preseason, much was made about how this Indiana team could be deep and maybe there's 8 or 9 guys that could all play significant roles. But when it got down to the meat of the season, when the games really mattered, the bench offered little in terms of production. Do you see that as one of the maybe bigger failures of this season, just from a program perspective, the inability to find production and develop guys that were on the bench as the season moved along?
It wasn't good. Obviously, when you don't get any points out of the bench in more than 33 combined minutes against Miami, that was another big factor. They got outscored 14-0 in bench points. Malik Aminu usually played better than that, but he's not a super quick guy either, so I don't think he was a great matchup defensively. Tamar Bates never really got it going all year, and 0 for 7. I thought he played decent defense, but offensively never got anything going. And Caleb Banks, although he only played 2 minutes, actually showed, I thought, a flash of athleticism. Like he blocked a shot or got a steal or something. It looked like a guy who knew what he's doing. And he looks like he's got some potential for next year. But yeah, overall, the bench was not. The bench was a problem. It didn't really come through in the games. They had a bunch of games late in the year where a couple of those guys put up goose eggs, and Miami was coming at Indiana with 8 or 9 guys, and the guys they subbed in were just as quick as the guys who went to the bench.
Watching it on TV, it looked like Miami was just a step quicker pretty much everywhere than Indiana. We saw that on the rebounding. Watching it from your perspective, where you were at the game, did it feel that way in the arena? And were you surprised at just how effective Miami was with the rebounding and second chance points? I mean, Omier, I believe, had 17 rebounds total, 8 or 9 offensive boards. They outscore them 29 to 11 and second chance points. To me, some of that obviously is, the ball bouncing your way at certain times, but when the discrepancy is that big, it lends the question, is Indiana, were they, did Miami want it more? Were they just smarter about, crashing the glass and how they got the balls? But what it just up close and seeing it live, did it feel like there was maybe a little bit more intensity and more want to from the Miami side of things on the rebounding?
Yeah, I think it was all of those things. From where I was sitting, it looked like Miami was playing with a bit of annoyance that they were tired of hearing about Indiana, or people thinking Indiana was better than them, or that that the ACC wasn't as a prime league and they were the last ACC team standing. So I thought they did play with more of an edge. They certainly were more athletic and chased down the vast majority of the long rebounds. They did a great job of positioning around the basket to get offensive rebounds. They had 19 offensive rebounds, and Indiana only had 20 defensive rebounds. That's never a good ratio for if you're the team that is defensive rebounding. And they had more lift. They had more, quick jumpers who could get up multiple times. Again, with Kopp and Thompson are not explosive athletes. And in those scrums where there were multiple guys going up for rebounds, the Miami guys were getting more of them because they're more athletic. And that was an issue. And, that has been an issue really all year. That Kopp basically is a one-trick pony of making threes. Occasionally he'll make a shot inside the line, but he's not going to drive the ball and get to the rim. And Race Thompson, for as good as he's been over 6 years as a power player, he's a bit of an undersized power player who's not an explosive leaper. And when you get against guys who can do that, I think he struggles at times. So, I think they gave fine effort. It's just that they were overmatched physically by more wiry type, thinner, more explosive athletes. Indiana Thompson's more of a power player. He's more of a Big Ten type player. When you get it against guys who are, can jump quicker and jump higher than you can, that's a problem.
You mentioned Indiana's two best players earlier, Trace Jackson-Davis and Jalen Hood-Schifino. I want to talk about both of those guys, maybe in a little bit different context. But with Jackson-Davis, you wrote a column before the Miami game, just talking about really the only thing missing from his legacy in terms of his career is the winning at the highest level. Obviously comes up short in the regular season with the Big Ten, and then gets Indiana, to the round of 32. But I think when you look at the great players that have played in Bloomington, all of them have either Big Ten titles or deeper NCAA tournament runs. That's the one thing really missing with Trace. How do you think he'll be remembered historically as a player at Indiana?
He should be remembered fondly. It's a different era than it used to be, and nobody stays at his level of ability. Few guys stay 4 years anymore, and he did that. And he did it in the beginning when he could have easily gone to Michigan State, a more established program, following like Jaren Jackson or doing what Xavier Booker's going to do. But he didn't do it. And he came and he believed in Archie Miller and tried to help. He followed Romeo and tried to get the program heading in the right direction. He made a great point in the press conference that it was only 2 years ago he was part of a team that got booed off the floor in the Big Ten tournament, and now they've gone to back-to-back NCAA tournaments. That being said, going to back-to-back NCAA tournaments is never going to be an acceptable outcome at Indiana. I mean, it just won't be. And for all the points he scored, for all the rebounds he never had enough help to do better than that. And it's not his fault. He did more than his share of doing it, but it's just reflective of he didn't have enough help around him, because when you look at the other guys on the list, Woodson, Alford, Chaney, although Woodson and Chaney didn't win national championships, they won Big Ten championships, and some of Scott May at Indiana. The standard needs to be get to a Final Four, win a Big Ten title, and he wasn't able to do that, and that's a pretty big void. I mean, they didn't win a Big Ten title the whole 4 years he was there. They didn't get to a Sweet 16 the time he was there, and so not being his fault, but he does. I can't put him up there with the other guys, because if you're going to maintain the standards of winning at the highest level, Indiana didn't get there during his time there.
Jalen Hood-Schifino obviously wins Big Ten Freshman of the Year, has a really good season, but by most standards, when you look at what he was able to do offensively, the performance that most people will remember was the 35 that he put on Purdue at Mackey Arena. Winning there is never easy to do. I thought he did a lot of really good things offensively in the Miami game. I thought defensively to start the game just wasn't really playing the way he needed to play, and then obviously took some shots throughout the game that maybe were ill-advised, made some threes late. But overall, how do you think he will be remembered by Indiana fans, assuming he's a one-and-done kid? It looks like most of the projections have him going in the first round of the NBA draft, if not higher into the lottery. So it seems like he's going to be one and done, but I'm curious how you think he'll be looked back on when it's all said and done.
He'll be remembered mainly positively and sort of symbolic of the new era of college sports, of a guy who came in for 1 year and did pretty well and then moves on, sort of like Romeo, Eric Gordon. Vonleh I wouldn't put in their category, because I never really felt like Vonleh was invested in the IU program. But, the games against Purdue, especially the game at Mackey Arena, will give him a spot, with Indiana fans of some contentment. But he's, to me, he played better than I thought he would play for a freshman, in terms of the fact that he had to become the leader of the team quicker than anybody thought he was going to have to be, because Xavier Johnson got hurt. And they initially, after Xavier Johnson got hurt, hit the skids and lost 3 in a row. And he and Jackson Davis were the guys who got it turned around, so the season didn't totally go down the drain. So even though his game against Miami wasn't one of his best games. I think he'll be remembered positively for what he did in Indiana. And what I'm curious about is whether his career in Indiana will have any carryover effect to convince more players of his ability level to come play at Indiana by saying, he went there for 1 year and had success and went to the pros, and whether Mike Woodson wants to keep going down that road, because that's a tricky road to navigate, because you're constantly working young players in, and not all of them can be, as successful as what Shafino was.
Malik Aminu was another guy that was a freshman this season and had some bright spots. What, in your mind, are the biggest keys for him this offseason? It seems that with what Indiana's losing in the front court, that he's going to be a big piece to the puzzle next season in Bloomington. What are maybe if you had to identify a couple things that he really needs to get better at to be able to play significant minutes and be productive next season, what would those be?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see whether they play him at a 4 or 5. If he plays the 5, he's going to be undersized. And so if you're going to play the 5, then he's going to have to learn to shoot the ball better and bring his defender away from the basket. He's obviously going to have to develop or create more of an offensive game other than backing people down and throwing in those, hook shots and bank shots around the basket. He's got to be able to make the defense fear him away from the basket. He's obviously got to cut down on turnovers, which means become a better ball handler and passer. And he probably has to become, a quicker, stronger athlete so he can defend guys. He had problems all year getting in foul trouble and with turnovers, and that's typical for freshmen. And I think he can overcome that. But I would be surprised if he's not like the first or second leading scorer in the team next year.
When you look at what Mike Woodson's been able to do through 2 seasons, obviously getting back to Indiana, back to the tournament is something that shouldn't be taken for granted. When you look at Tom Crean wins 2 Big Ten titles in the span of 4 years, but his undoing was obviously not being able to string together consecutive seasons of success. Archie Miller spends 4 seasons in Bloomington, has the 1 year where they probably make the tournament, but it was canceled due to COVID and was ultimately dismissed. Mike Woodson comes in, first 2 seasons, makes the tournament, although the standard at Indiana is higher than just making the tournament. I feel like he's brought some stability to the program from that regard. How would you kind of characterize the first 2 seasons that he's led the program, and just overall, how should Indiana fans feel kind of about the direction of the program after Woodson's first 2 years?
I mean, I agree with what Woodson said himself after the game. Is like they did some really good things, but got to be better. Players got to be better, and he's got to be better. And he's right. I mean, it's a process of building a program. People aren't as patient as they used to be. Players, the roster turns over more quickly. It's easier to rebuild, or the opportunity to rebuild is faster because of the transfer portal. So I think overall he's done a very good job, but he's got to get better in terms of, I think what they got to get better at is, just improving the depth and the talent base of the roster. And as I said in the very beginning, they need more guys at the 1, 2, 3, and 4 spot who are true, like, triple threat players. I mean, guys who can handle the ball and shoot from the perimeter, B, drive the ball, and C, finish at the rim. And I'm talking about guys like, a Troy Williams was, or Yogi Ferrell was, or Isaiah Thomas was. There aren't many of those guys, but you got to have guys on your team that can beat you in multiple ways. And I think that's what Indiana's kind of been missing. You got to have those guys who in the 6'4", 6'7" range, who, like, the defense always has to be fearful or aware of where they are on the floor, because they know when they get the ball, that guy's a threat. And I don't think they had that this year. They had, Cobb was basically just a shooter who could make shots often when only would want to shoot the ball when he was wide open. Galloway, made some shots against Miami, but not a consistent shooter. Got to have more guys that can really score the ball effectively, I think.
When you look at just the style of play that Indiana, under Woodson the first 2 years, it was obviously tailored towards Trace Jackson Davis because he's an All-American and he's going to get you good, efficient looks at the rim. He's going to be going out the door, obviously, after the season. And so it kind of opens up an opportunity for Woodson to maybe play a little bit differently, perhaps take more threes. They were a much better three-point shooting team this season from a percentage standpoint, but it didn't matter all that much because they didn't take enough threes. Do you think Woodson needs to recalibrate in general how he wants to play moving forward now that Trace is gone? And does this kind of the roster turnover give him a chance to maybe become more dynamic in terms of how he builds a team offensively?
Yeah, he was asked that question after the game and said, if you look at his record in the NBA, he never really played with what he would call, quote, a traditional center. But that Jackson Davis was such a good player, they went to him. And he did develop. I mean, Jackson Davis, I thought, became a much better player in 2 years under Mike Woodson, better ball handler, better with right hand. Never did really get comfortable shooting the ball. Became a better free throw shooter. I mean, he made his free throws against Miami. But, I do think they need to become a little bit more invested in the three-point shot. As you said, they did shoot a higher percentage, but it seemed like the three-pointers were, probably the third or fourth, fifth option on the offense. The options were high pick and roll and getting the ball inside to Jackson Davis and with Shafino taking mid-range shots, and then three-point shots would be the fourth or fifth choice. So in today's college basketball, the teams that are really good have a couple of guys who you really have to fear from three, who can get their own shots, don't have to be set up for their shots, and again, that's what they need. And who those guys are going to be, I don't know yet, but I think they know that. I think they want that. It's a matter of whether they can get those kind of players.
How challenging is it going to be to put together a team for next season that's capable of getting back to the NCAA tournament with all of the players that they have to replace and the challenge of going into the transfer portal? Obviously, there's going to be a lot of players in the portal, but I feel like there's only a select number of maybe major difference makers that are going to be in there, and all of the top programs are going to want those guys. So it seems like it becomes pretty important to have relationships maybe pre-existing with some of these players and also identify the guys who can actually help you. Example being a guy like Jalen Pickett that Penn State identified a couple of years ago out of Siena. He comes in and they're able to turn him into an all Big Ten player in a couple of years. Jameer Young is another one out of Maryland that was at Charlotte. They found from a lower level. And I'm just curious, how do you think it's going to be a tough hill to climb to be able to get the talent assembled for next season to be able to go back to the tournament?
I mean, it's not going to be easy. I'm sure that they've already had plenty of discussions about who they want and try and make an evaluation of how realistic their chances are to get those guys. You got to know what your system is and what you're recruiting to, and who you have a realistic chance of getting and who you're wasting your time on. But I don't remember people jumping up and down and throwing confetti when Penn State got Jalen Pickett. They probably just thought, didn't he come from Drexel or something? Like
Siena.
Siena, okay. Like nobody really, I think, thought that was that big of a deal. You got to have people on your staff who've identified some guys, at least maybe one or two under the radar dudes who can come in and play. I mean, look at Miami's team. The Miller kid who had such a good game last night, he came from George Mason, and I doubt he was considered some coup when they got him there. So find a couple of those guys. Huh?
Amir came from Arkansas State, so okay. He had 17 rebounds.
Okay, all right. So you got to find, and obviously Nigel Pack was their big guy out of the portal, and he got the $800,000 contract. So you got to find some guys who you really think fit what you're trying to do, and go get them. Because in today's age, that's what everybody's doing. It's not like the old days when you can just bring in 4 freshmen and slowly develop. It doesn't work that way. And if freshmen don't play, a lot of times they get discouraged and have the ability to put their name in the portal and find out who else really wants them.
Last thing before we wrap up, I was thinking about this last night. The last time the Big Ten won a national championship, I was actually in the building. The year was 2000. Michigan State and Mateen Cleaves cut down the nets in Indianapolis. It's been a long 23 years, and I think just as somebody who's followed Big Ten basketball for most of my life, it's been. If you would have told me back then, 23 years later, the Big Ten wouldn't have another national championship, I would have said you were crazy. But here we are, and Michigan State's still the last team standing. Obviously, they have a chance, but it seems unlikely that the Big Ten is going to win a national championship. What do you think's the biggest thing holding the league back from getting teams? They've had teams in the Final Four and had chances to win it, but this is a significant drought. And I think as I watch the league more and more, these regular seasons with a 20-game schedule, teams beating each other up all season, the style of play, there's something that just isn't connecting when we get to the tournament. I also think when you look at some of these McDonald's All-American lists, there's not as much talent coming into the Big Ten. I think that has something to do with it too. But what do you think is the biggest thing holding the Big Ten back from ultimately winning a national championship right now?
We could talk for hours about that. I think part of the drought is randomness of the tournament and how hard it is to win. I mean, it's not like they've had a number of times they've got to the championship game and got beat. They've had other times that they've had teams in the Final Four that just got beat by better teams. I think that overall, though, I think one thing that I believe is an issue for the Big Ten is that more than other leagues remains more committed to power type basketball. You have more post players in the Big Ten. You had Edey this year, which was the way Purdue played. And when they got in the tournament, when Edey was taken away, they failed. You had Indiana with Jackson Davis, but not having enough help around him. And they got beat. You had Michigan, which was supposed to be really good with Hunter Dickinson, and that didn't work. I mean, I think you've got not enough teams in the Big Ten, I guess what I'm trying to say, have really embraced and adopted the more modern way of basketball of like what you need is like 3 or 4 really good guards. And I don't think the guards this year in the Big Ten were great. And I think that's a little bit captured by the fact that the best guard in the league was Jalen Pickett, who came into the league from another school. There was nobody in the league at the guard position who was a veteran Big Ten guard who was better than him. And you got to get away from some of the more rough and tumble, hand check in the lane style of play that the Big Ten is known for, because it doesn't seem to serve them well in the postseason.
How's the road trip coming back so far?
Well, we've gone about 115 miles, and we only have 700 to go. So ask me when we get home. We're scheduled now to get home, I think, I don't know what time, 8:30, 9 o'clock maybe.
Okay.
I don't know. It's pretty boring, this part of the state. We've just gone through Syracuse. Rochester's next. And the next highlight of our trip, we've committed ourselves to finding a Culver's in Ohio to eat a Butterburger for dinner. So that's what we're looking forward to.
One other thing, I know you went to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. What was that like?
It's fantastic. I was surprised at how remote of a location it is. It's out in the middle of nowhere. And it's a very small town. But walking in there and seeing a bunch of the exhibits of, historical exhibits of baseball and uniforms and videos of games and Babe Ruth and Hank Aaron and lockers from Stan Musial or lot of players' former lockers are in there, and there's like a 17-minute movie they show that's sort of pretty emotional with people talking about what baseball means to them and means to the country. It had Cal Ripken and Vince Scully and Pedro Martinez and a bunch of guys in that. And then at the very end, we went down on the main floor, which is where all the plaques are, and just to go through the plaques year by year of all the great players who were honored there. Liking baseball as much as I do, it was very significant for me. And then at the very end, we went in the room where they have a pretty substantial exhibit for the famous broadcasters and writers, and I saw the Hawk Harrelson plaque, and Harry Carey, who did do White Sox games, and Bob Elson, who's the White Sox announcer I listened to when I was growing up. And then I actually, having covered 10 World Series, knew a bunch of the writers there, and to see the plaques for, Jerome Holtzman and Jim Murray and Peter Gammons and Roger Angel and all these guys who covered nothing but baseball when baseball was far and away the most popular sport in the country. It meant a lot to me, and I'm glad I went.
Well, that's great. Have a safe rest of your trip back, and thanks for taking the time to talk some Indiana basketball today with us on Podcast on the Brink.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. As always, if you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.